That was fabulous. I can't stop smiling. I have chills. That was beautiful. Now I'd like to invite you to take a look at the cover of your bulletin. If you notice, that very painting is on this easel here next to the communion table. A few weeks ago, I was at an antique mall in Stratford, the one right off the road, Honey Spot. If you turn left, you go to the Habitat Restore, where I got some furniture for my little house here. If you go right, you find this big blue tin building that happens to be one of those antique malls with hundreds of booths filled with relics from the past. As it turns out, it's one of my favorite things to do is kind of wander through these buildings. One day I was there for well over an hour when I turned down the last aisle, and this painting took my breath away. I just saw it there hanging on the wall. I saw the faces of these women, and through this painting, I saw the faces of all the women that I have partnered with around the world. My work around the world, not a whole lot shocks me, not a whole lot makes me capture, or kind of like, not a whole lot grabs my breath. However, when I read that the scripture assigned for today's story, or for today's lesson, was the story of Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah, my breath was taken away for a second time in less than a month. Because as you can imagine, this painting came to my mind's eye, and I saw in these women, Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah. This service, or the idea for this service, was birthed for me the day I went back to that blue antique mall in Stratford to buy this painting by Turkish artist Nuri Yem. I knew then that today's communion table would reflect the survival of the women I partnered with in these conflict zones around the world. I knew that a few of their stories needed to be told because they are kinswomen of Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah. Just a quick review. First, think about this. Naomi's family was forced to leave their homeland to save their lives because of famine. As we know, because maybe of the television news across time, famine is not isolated. Famine breeds extreme hunger, malnutrition, disease, despair, and death. And famine is often partnered with government corruption, civil wars, and the misuse of local resources. Then we learn that within a decade, living as refugees in the land of Moab, Naomi's family is all but destroyed by the death of her husband and her adult sons. For a second time, Naomi's family lives through death and dislocation. The women have no male kinsmen to protect them financially or physically. There is no doubt in my mind that these women knew exactly how vulnerable they were and how dangerous their situation had become. I imagine that alongside their grief and sorrow was bone-chilling fear and perhaps terror. Because there's nothing more vulnerable than being a woman without the protection of men in ancient Israel. As a result of this, they are forced to flee again to avoid certain suffering and even death. Orpah honorably returns to the house of her mother, to her mother's family where she grew up and knew nurturing and comfort. Ruth and Naomi return to Bethlehem. But this book, the book of Ruth, is a story about survival. They all survived. And I wonder, maybe Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah's suffering and fear are reflected in the eyes and the expressions of the women in the painting. Expressions that are sort of stunned, yet resistant and resilient. The women I have worked and lived beside around the globe are also survivors. They have survived unspeakable terrors of war, hunger, death, and the chaos of quite literally running for their lives with nothing but their children and the clothes on their backs, because chances are their husbands have already been killed. Women who live in war zones and places of extreme oppression are as vulnerable, unprotected, and fearful as I imagine our biblical women were in the land of Moab. So let me tell you just a few of their stories. I'd like to lift up to you Sister Rosemary. Sister Rosemary is a Catholic nun who lives in Gulu Town in northern Uganda. When I was in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and in Uganda in 2006, we stayed at the school that she operates. This school is a school for girls and, I would say, teenagers and young women who have escaped being child soldiers and what they call war wives of the Lord's Resistance Army, a group that has terrorized and perpetrated terrible horrors for over 20 years in Uganda, and that was in 2006. Some of these young girls fled on their own and escaped from being sexual slaves or child soldiers, and they brought their children with them, children born during slavery. Rosemary and the other nuns at this school welcomed these young women and teens, girls pushed to the edge of society because of the atrocities they committed, being soldiers, because they had children by rebel soldiers. People feared retaliation for their escape, and people feared disease. The sisters at this school also welcomed another group of children. These children are boys and girls as young perhaps as the children here on our steps this morning, or the ages of you young folks in the choir. These kids in Uganda during the time of the worst fighting by the Lord's Resistance Army had to flee their homes every single night because they would be kidnapped as child soldiers and as war wives. These children were welcomed back at the school into the buildings that were not occupied by the students. I have just distinct images of open buildings surrounded by trees and open space, and African women, Ugandan women, cooking meals for these children, and these children would just appear. I have no idea where they came from, but they would come there at night, they would eat, and they would sleep in the open air shelters at the school. And they did this so they could live and so they could survive, because the rebel soldiers knew not to come to the school. In the mornings, they would quietly disappear back to their own communities. The girls that came to this school, sometimes with their own children, were trained in skills that helped them find jobs in the community. They were educated because they often were taken at the ages of 10 and 11 or younger. Sister Rosemary and the women at this school helped transform their lives. They helped them have new life. They all together participated in resurrection of these young women because they were offered a chance of survival through being embraced by the church. Let me tell you a story from Mayan Christian peacemakers in Chiapas who have fled their own homes and were living as what they call internally displaced people in Mexico, which means that they fled their communities because of terror, but they didn't leave their countries and cross an international border. Rather, they regrouped in refugee camps. One of those communities is called Acteal. In 1997, there was a massacre in Acteal where over 40 women and children and men were massacred by their neighbors. Also people claiming to be Christians. I went there soon after that on a delegation, and then the year later I went there to work with the Catholic Church as an ecumenical worker. And I distinctly remember going into the low brick building, long brick building. At one end are the pictures of the deceased with the candles lit, not much different than our own celebration here today. After the memorial mass, we would process really down into the grave house, and the women and the men who were left behind would wail and cry and pray out loud, expressing their grief at their loss. And I also remember being nurtured in Shoyep, which is another camp, another refugee camp in Chiapas, where the only thing that the family could offer us was a cup of hot coffee. They call it tinto, because it's really water with a little coffee. Because that is what they had to offer. That is what they had for themselves, and that is what they could give visitors who were accompanying them as they struggled to free themselves from the violence of military oppression. I can remember those images like they're in my head, like they're pictures taken, like they're photographs. I can remember the children playing in Acteal, running around, playing with chickens and all the things that little children do in rural communities. I remember my friend's daughter, Corey Chupp, being a little 10-year-old, the summer I met them, playing along with these children. She was adopted from Nicaragua, and it was quite amazing how she just blended right in, and the children and families welcomed her as their own. And I also remember being in the Congo in 2006. I remember our delegation from Women to Women, because the women of the Congo, our partners, wanted only women to come so that they could tell their stories of war and suffering to Christian women who could then be witnesses to their story back in their home countries. And I can remember we slept in like dormitories. We had mosquito nets, and the women cooked over open fires, big open fires, and they were able to feed 30 of us. They collected the wood, they brought it in, they made meat stew and rice and different things with something they call ugali, a local sustenance made out of yucca. And I remember one night we were trying to get to Rwanda to get our way to the northern part of the eastern Congo, past Lake Kivu, and we got trapped at the Rwandan border because we weren't paying close enough attention to time, and we got to the border after it closed. And you know, maybe that could be not a big deal, right? You could, get back in your car, go home, go to a hotel. However, the border between Rwanda and the Congo doesn't quite have those amenities, and we had nowhere to go. And we were women without the protection of men. There may be 2 of our drivers were there. And I can tell you that there are a few times in my life when I feared that I would die, and that was one of them. I didn't know what was going to happen. We had nowhere to be. But down the street, it turns out there was a convent. And we went over there, and we rang the bell in the dark of night in a place known for terror and hostility, and someone answered the door. And when they heard of our predicament, they let us spend the night. And they gave us breakfast in the morning before we went on our way. And I believe those women not only saved our lives, but were truly the embodiment of Christ. And that food was the food of communion. Now let's venture back to today. Now when I hung this picture in my living room, it's right next to my couch on the wall, so I see it every day. I see it from the dining room, I see it from the living room. You know, it has a prominent place. I knew that today's communion table would reflect the table of these women from around the world. I knew that this communion table would represent the fire pits of women in the Congo, and the coffee pots and stew pots of the women in Chiapas, and represent the hospitality, the radical inclusivity of Sister Rosemary and the other nuns in Uganda. And these are women that I admire and love. Women who've invited so many people to sit by their fires and to be nurtured by the food of community. These women's gathering places were in rural homes and in camps. It was their hearthhold that we sat around to be nurtured and cared for. And I learned from some African women theologians, that they understand hearths or hearthholds, the space around the fire, to be the place where God is present. This is a place where they sustain not only the lives of their own families, but they sustain the lives of anyone who comes past for nurture. Even someone like me, a foreigner who lost her way. In times of greatest joy and in times of greatest sorrow, they welcome children, they welcome men and boys, they welcome the stranger. And to me, that is an amazing example of Christ's inclusive love and what the communion table is about. If their hearthholds can be as expansive as that, so too is our communion table as expansive today, to welcome in all of us today, no matter who we are, where we come from, no matter our stories of suffering or our stories of joy. For Christ is at this table with us, like Christ was at the tables of those women around the world. And I'm going to end with a question Reverend Olson postured to me a few weeks ago in a meeting. Reverend Olson is part of the Committee on Ministry of the Fairfield East Association, and they were interviewing me, and they said, and Reverend Olson asked me, said, so, what similarities do you see between the people you work with around the world in these war zones and the people here at the south end of Bridgeport, where you now live and work? And the answer, I think, came relatively quickly. They are all survivors. The women and their families from the places of war and conflict that I have worked with are survivors, just like Ruth, Naomi, and Orpah. The men and women and children of the south end of Bridgeport, or the south end of many other cities throughout the United States, are also survivors of systems of oppression and economic injustice. When they pass through our doors here at the corner of Park and State to share a meal on Thursday, to receive infant formula and diapers from Bonnie, or to come for groceries on Wednesday nights, they are being welcomed to our communion table. Even though they don't often gather with us on Sundays at this table, they too are members of God's nurturing love and are welcome to this table of joy and new life. All of us and all those who gather for our programs here are indeed welcome to this table of love. As we come this morning, we're invited to also be survivors and to flourish in our own stories, because we all participate in the story of faithfulness and the story of God's love and Christ's renewal here in Bridgeport and from all the places you come. So let us come forth with joy, and let us come forth with the stories of the women in our lives who nurtured us to this place, those living and those who have already passed away. Amen.